Hi, I'm Trina Turk, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio. Oh, look at that woman has a Vera bag. Oh. One of the new Vera bags.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Nowhere in the world celebrates modernism better than Modernism Week in Palm Springs, California, every February. This 11-day architecture and design festival hosts exciting modernist house tours, insightful lectures, designer shopping, architecture documentary premieres, eye-popping house parties, detailed exhibitions, and much more. And for almost 10 years, U.S. Modernist Radio has been your gateway to all the action, reporting from the U.S. Modernist Compound, aka poolside at the hip Hotel Skylark, interviewing guests in the world of architecture and design. I'm Tom Guild. Over this spring and summer, we'll bring you over 25 interviews, plus special guests recorded right here in the studio. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. While architecture schools at colleges and universities generate most of our architects, the field is also moved forward by individual practitioners, sometimes self-taught. Today, we'll hear about two such innovators who shaped modernism in Southern California. Prolific architect and architectural historian Alan Hess talks about California architect Irving Gill, who was doing modernism way back in 1905, after the Wright brothers, but before Frank Lloyd Wright, before Neutra, even before the Bauhaus. We'll then talk with returning podcast guest Erin Ellwood, daughter of Craig Ellwood, on her father's singular legacy. Later, we'll check in with the enchanting vocalist Lucy Woodward. And now, the guy whose orange party blazer can be seen from space, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. There are only a few places I can wear that thing, and one of them is Palm Springs. If you're into mid-century modernism, Modernism Week in Palm Springs is the Super Bowl of all the architecture we love. Want to go with us in February 2025 and stay with us at the U.S. Modernist Compound? Email me at george@usmodernist.org.
Architect Alan Hess is the author of more than 20 books on architecture. Born in California, Alan studied architecture at UCLA. The former architecture critic for the San Jose Mercury News, he has written extensively on Frank Lloyd Wright, Oscar Niemeyer, ranch houses, Googie, and John Lautner. Alan has been on U.S. Modernist Radio more than any other guest because he's one of the most knowledgeable people on modernism in the world, and he's a really nice guy. Here's George's conversation with Alan Hess, recorded poolside at the U.S. Modernist Compound.
It is my great pleasure to be sitting here in the Palm Springs sun at the Hotel Skylark with Alan Hess, who is, by far, the Yoda of modern architecture. He has written, how many books? 29?
21.
21.
22 coming out next year.
22 coming out next year on virtually every major mid-century architect there is, plus more. He is a constant figure at Modernism Week. So much we have to get him some sleep, extra sleep every night because they've got him speaking. He's doing panels. He's doing tours. He's going to the art museum later today to talk to kids about Albert Frey. I thank you for all this, Alan. I mean, I know this takes up a lot of your time, so.
It does, but it is really the fun thing. All the work that I do all the rest of the year, sitting alone in front of my computer, writing or whatever, it all pays out when I can actually talk with real people at Modernism Week.
And a lot of real people show up here. Something like 120,000 tickets and 30,000, 40,000 people, and it's pretty incredible what this has been built into.
Yeah.
Now, when people think of mid-century modernism, some people think 50s right away. Then they learn a little more, and then they think, well, maybe 30s, and then they learn a little more, and then they kind of dial back to people like we're going to talk about today, a man named Irving Gill, who was doing this stuff like 1905, 1908. It just blew my mind when I found out about this.
Yeah.
Who was Irving Gill?
Irving Gill was an architect in the San Diego and the Los Angeles area from the 1890s until he passed away in 1936, which is one reason why we don't know much about him, because he died early. And all his contemporaries went on to live another 30, 40, 50 years, established their reputations, but Gill didn't have that opportunity. But the important thing about Irving Gill is that when he was a young man in the 1890s, he was in Chicago, and he was working for a firm, Adler and Sullivan. He was working with Louis Sullivan. And at another drafting table in that office at that same time was another young architect named Frank Lloyd Wright.
A man with a little bit of promise.
Yes, yes. And so Gill kind of learned his trade, but also his whole concept of what modern architecture was about from Louis Sullivan. You just don't get any better at any time, but especially then, because modernism was not codified at that time. It wasn't defined. It could go in any direction, and it was going in many different directions, but especially there in Chicago with the steel frame, the invention of the skyscraper, etc. That was one of the most important early manifestations where these brilliant architects like Louis Sullivan, but also Burnham and Root and others, were trying to figure out, what do we do with these new materials? We don't have to make it into a Gothic building or a Renaissance building. We can make it something entirely new, because these materials are letting us do amazing things never before possible in the history of mankind. So that's where he started. And then he moved to San Diego in 1893.
He would have been about 24 or so, roughly?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. But why San Diego? Well, why not? I mean, even Los Angeles at that time wasn't that big, and certainly not a capital on the architecture scene at all. But, of course, a beautiful city, a beautiful climate, a lot of interesting new building going on. And so he started to evolve what he thought modern architecture would be in that environment. And it's interesting, his story kind of undermines a lot of the myths.
Right. That's what's so fascinating about it.
Exactly. For example, he was really interested in concrete technology. So he used a system of what we now call tilt-up concrete construction.
What is that?
That's where you have a large wall of a building, you frame it, exact size, dimension, height, and so forth, but flat on the ground.
Okay.
And then you pour your concrete and you let it cure, and then you have a system to tilt up that big slab into an upright position where it will be in the wall of the building. That's the simple thing. It's a system that's, of course, still used today, mostly for industrial buildings, warehouse buildings. But Gill, and this is, in the very beginning of the 20th century, was experimenting with that. Now, at the exact same time, there were other architects who were experimenting with concrete, like the great Albert Kahn in Detroit. Mm-hmm. His experiments in concrete, different method, but again, concrete was this new material. I mean, it had been used by the Romans, but in the 20th century, it was being experimented with and made scientific. How much of this material, how much cement you put in, how long do you let it cure, what's the strength, how do you reinforce it? All of those questions were being answered through experiment and scientific research to see how concrete, a modern material, could be used for making glorious modern buildings.
Now, in Europe, when Adolf Loesch was doing early modernist buildings, there was great hue and cry that this was just awful, this new thing. It had no ornament. Was that same reaction in San Diego with Irving Gill and his first projects?
Yes, there was. There were major people in the architecture community who thought that what Gill was doing was, quote, unrefined. He did not, because he was just taking this concrete system as is. He didn't need to add ornament of some sort to it. So yes, there were many. But it's interesting. There was another very prominent architect at that time, Bertram Goodhue, who said, well, I don't entirely agree with Gill's lack of ornament, but what he is doing is the most interesting, imaginative use of architecture anywhere. And there's more to be learned from Irving Gill than from my work or your work, pointing at some of the other distinguished members of the architecture profession. But there's another element to this. Okay, so we can see Gill was modern. He was dealing with a modern material, etc. That modern technology always influences modern architecture. But in 1899, he had a project to stabilize the old Adobe mission in San Diego, which was from the early 19th century. But as he stabilized it, figured out how to preserve it, he was also looking at it. What was the construction method? What was the architecture and the design? It had, of course, colonnades. It had arcades which sheltered from the sun. But it had outdoor rooms and so forth, which suited the climate. So Irving Gill was learning from the historical buildings of that area, which he then integrated into his own buildings. And this is one of the, again, myths about modern architecture. When we look too closely and too much at the European modernists, who often were rejecting anything having to do with history.
Right.
They were saying, forget it all. It was kings and wars, and we're just looking towards the future and the new man, the new society. But in California, the modernists who were creating modernism there, they didn't have that baggage. So Gill willingly and very intelligently learned from history as well as modern technology, put them together, and that was, with his architectural brilliance, what he came up with. And it took a while for that all to gel. But by about 1906, 7, so forth, he was on his way to defining what modern architecture was all about for him.
So he started out in houses, right? And did he wind up by his death doing commercial projects in modern in San Diego?
Well, his career really kind of was tragic. I mean, he was very successful. He was doing a lot of houses, some very large houses for wealthy people. And he was doing churches, he was doing high-rise buildings, he was doing theaters, he was doing also, in particular, the Women's Club of La Jolla, which is one of his masterpieces. So yeah, he was really getting a great reputation, being well-known, getting great commissions. And then came the 1915 Pacific California Exposition, which was a World's Fair in San Diego. And he was set up to be the architect of the fair. But then, because of politics and other things, another architect, Bertram Goodhue, from the East Coast, very distinguished, kind of swooped in and took over that commission.
Oh.
And it turned out to be one of the most influential World's Fairs, certainly in terms of California. It really reintroduced the Spanish colonial revival style, which swept the state and the West, really. But Gill still went on. He did some marvelous buildings until around 1920, early 20s, when Craftsman style began to go out of style. The Prairie style was going out of style, and his career kind of stalled.
Yeah.
At that point. He still did a couple of really beautiful buildings, so he still had his creativity. But by 1930, he was so without jobs that he took a job supervising an avocado orchard in the Oceanside area. And He got a couple of small commissions in Oceanside for a city hall and a fire station, but that was the end of his career. And he died in 1936. And he just dropped off the radar screen for anybody interested in architecture at that time, unfortunately.
And when did he start to pop back on the radar of people researching architecture?
Yeah, well, there weren't many notable architecture historians or critics who went to San Diego in those days. Nobody expected to find anything there. But there were a few who saw photographs of these brilliant early, 1907 buildings, crisp, modern, no ornament, flat, planar surfaces, beautiful arcades along them, and made out of concrete. So there was a great question in the architecture community about, well, who is this guy? And they were puzzling, and they thought of Adolf Loos.
Right.
Because Adolf Loos, contemporary, but over in Austria,
Yep.
but also very clean, crisp buildings with geometric window cutouts and so forth. Very similar visually to what Gill was doing. So it's interesting, and this has to do with how architectural history works. These historians were so sure that modernism had started in Europe with people like Adolf Loos that they said, well, there must be a connection there. Gill must have looked at a building
Right.
of Loos's. And so that's the connection. So they went through all of these kind of intellectual gymnastics to try to fit Gill into the story that they already had, that modernism started in Europe.
Yeah.
They didn't realize that Gill represented an entirely different and original track of modern architecture, but rooted in, for heaven's sakes, in Louis Sullivan, which was kind of the godfather of all modernism as far as I'm concerned. So it wasn't until 1960 that the great architecture critic Esther McCoy wrote a book, Five California Architects, and Gill was one of those. And the purpose of it was to put a spotlight on people who were important at that time. The book also included Rudolf Schindler, as a matter of fact, who had been forgotten by that time also.
Really?
Another tragic story.
So he came back on the radar too.
Because of Esther McCoy. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, and God bless him, even today, this part of architectural history, of where modernism started, with Sullivan in Chicago and in California with Irving Gill, but also Lloyd Wright and Rudolf Schindler. Schindler, his most famous house, of course, is his own house on Kings Road in Los Angeles.
Yes.
It was just a couple of blocks from one of Irving Gill's masterpieces, the Dodge House of 1914. And Schindler learned a lot and knew Gill, and Gill influenced not only Schindler, but also Richard Neutra.
Yes.
So again, that just cements his importance. He set out some ideas that these other very good architects picked up on and carried on, had their own influence. Even the case study houses of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, even though they were different materials, they were steel or wood, but that simplicity that Gill had defined back in 1907 carried through as part of the atmosphere of modernism in California.
Did Gill have children?
Nope.
So there are no other Gills carrying this forward?
No, he did have actually a nephew who did work with him as an architect, but there's nothing there in terms of continuity.
And I noticed that 79 years after his death, the Irving Gill Foundation was put together.
Yes.
And how did that come about? Do you know?
Well, fortunately, the people of San Diego do appreciate Irving Gill, and have for a number of years now. And there are historians who have preserved his houses, written about him, so we do have some information, but it's kind of just been contained in San Diego. There's one thing that was one reason why I gave this talk on Irving Gill here at Modernism Week, was to hopefully reawaken more broadly, nationally, understanding of just how important, because his importance is that at the very beginning of what we now call modern architecture, you had Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, who were instrumental in defining, what is this all about? Mm-hmm. But Irving Gill was just as important in creating new ideas about what to do with these modern technologies and how to live with them in houses or high-rises or churches or whatever.
I suspect over time we'll learn about these guys in Russia or China or Africa who reacted to concrete similarly, and we just don't know their histories yet.
Yeah. No, 10, 12 years ago, I was in Moscow and got a great tour of the constructivist architects of the teens and 20s there. I was blown away. I mean, the engineering skill and the formal imagination was brilliant. And, before the Iron Curtain fell, we had absolutely almost no idea about any of those.
No, we really didn't. I mean, even many of the spectacular brutalist buildings of the 60s and early 70s in the former USSR, very few photos of those came out of that. And now those countries are trying to figure out what to do with these massive buildings.
Yeah.
It's quite a challenge.
Well, also, Gill started, again, out of the Sullivan tradition. Gill, was the next generation. But you can follow the use of concrete through the line of organic architects that follows from Louis Sullivan. Frank Lloyd Wright, the Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois. And then, of course, Rudolf Schindler, the Lovell Beach House, concrete, magnificent, and now very well known. You also have Lloyd Wright's Oasis Hotel right here in Palm Springs from 1924, which really is, if you're going to be technical about it, the first modern building in Palm Springs.
Okay, I did not know that.
Yeah, and
everyone thinks it's Albert Frey, right?
That was, 1933, 34? Yeah. 1924 is before 1934. People don't seem to understand this. Yeah, so, but then you also have John Lautner using concrete, and then even more recently, Kendrick Kellogg, also architect, again, concrete, and he was influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. So you see this. I mean, it's concrete. Is it brutalist? We can argue about the definitions there, but it's a different
I guess it depends on
look.
how many tons you have, right?
Yes. I prefer to call it béton brut because it doesn't sound so nasty.
Yes, right, exactly. What book are you working on next, Alan?
Well, one that's actually already off to the publishers is the Palm Springs School of Architecture. It'll be out for Modernism Week in 2025.
Okay.
Stay
tuned.
Going to be published by Rizzoli. The purpose of it is that modern architecture here in Palm Springs, we think of individual houses that are just beautiful examples of architecture. But underlying that, actually, for all of these architects, for Don Wexler and Stuart Williams and William Cody and Bill Kreisel and everyone here, there were common concepts that they were working with. Reacting to the climate, reacting to the natural setting, reacting to the economy of Palm Springs. So there are these lessons about what modern architecture is and how those mid-century modern Palm Springs architects advanced it that need to be understood. So that's the purpose of it, to show that there were these really brilliant ideas which have some usefulness today, especially the response to the climate. How do you design for passive solar, et cetera, et cetera? And so they're lessons for today in those mid-century architects.
Now, are all your books still in print? Can people get them like on Amazon or Powell's or places like that?
They aren't all in print, but yeah, a lot of them are available as used books or whatever through Amazon or the rest.
And Alan is also very much a film star, having appeared in more architecture documentaries than any person I know, like I think, 30 or 40 little things you've been in. There's always Alan Hess giving some very wise commentary about the meaning behind something, or how A influenced B, or B talked back to C. And
Yeah.
what have you got coming up in that? Do you know of any documentaries that you're in development?
No, my agent hasn't gotten on those yet. And, I get the big bucks for these
right.
Architectural documentaries, So, no, I don't think I have anything immediately coming out, but I'm always available.
Alan is always available. He does such a great job with the books, with the documentaries, and here at Modernism Week, you can catch his lectures, which are always packed with people. He also facilitates many of the panels, discussions that go on here, because it's likely that he knows just about as much as the experts do that he's facilitating, which is great. And you must have accumulated a massive amount of materials at your house by now, right?
Yes, that is a problem, what to do with them. I've got a lot of books, and some of them are very precious to me, like I have a copy of the Gebhardt and Winter Guide to Los Angeles, an early
Famous
version
guide,
of it.
yes.
And it's signed by David Gebhardt. And I also have 5 California architects signed by Esther McCoy. And I had her do it. I've got a copy of Robert Venturi's book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture,
Yes.
signed by Robert Venturi. You know what I also have? Maybe 30 or 40,000 35-millimeter slides.
Oh, yes.
And a lot of those are like of Los Angeles from when I went to architecture school there in the 1970s and 80s. And it's a different city today. So these slides document another city. So those are precious to me, but I got a lot of other stuff too.
So is there a plan, Alan? Is some famous university or archive going to get the Alan Hess collection?
Nobody's knocked on my door yet.
Well, as someone who has dealt with families of people who have passed away, and they tell me sadly over the phone that they've just thrown out boxes and boxes of slides or photos or plans or anything else, please call somebody and get them all set up to take your collection, because it would be a tragedy to lose all that research for your books, all the personal things that you've just mentioned. And of course, those slides are a great history.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I just got an email yesterday from a preservation architect who's doing work on Martin Stern Jr.
Okay.
Now, he designed Googie coffee shops like Ships in Westwood, which was one of the premier ones. He also designed hotels in Las Vegas, like the MGM Grand and the Flamingo, and several others as well.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, sure.
And I interviewed him. Again, he's long gone, but I interviewed him years ago. Those are somewhere in my files.
One of the greatest anonymous knocks on my front door was an architect who was dean of an architecture school. And in the 70s, he was going to write a book about architecture and structural engineering. And he took some sort of sabbatical for 2 months and went around the country with his cassette recorder, nothing fancy, and sat down in front of Nervi and Catalano and others and recorded hours and hours of interviews for a book that never materialized. Well, fast forward 40 years later, here he is at my front door with this shoebox of tapes and says, here. And we digitized all those and put them online.
That is really great about what you are involved with, George, because as I mentioned with Irving Gill, the historians of his times didn't know what to do with him. They didn't have the information. They didn't bother to visit his buildings or anything. So this thing of architectural history and recording it properly is so important for even architects who may not think are that important at the time.
Modernism Week, which is actually 11 days in February and actually 4 days in October. If you come, you will see somewhere Alan Hess. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, George.
That was George talking with author Alan Hess. Interior designer Erin Ellwood was born into a world of fame and glamour. The daughter of television actress Gloria Henry, who played the mom on TV's Dennis the Menace back in the 60s, and celebrated designer Craig Ellwood, the bad boy of LA architecture in the 60s and 70s, her family's pet was an ocelot, and her dad would drop her off at school in a lime green Lamborghini. That early immersion in the fast lane of Hollywood led to a 2-decade career in production design and art direction, including the iconic Levi's 501 TV spots from the 1990s. Now Erin works in interior design, lifestyle branding, and digital video content. She is co-editor of the book Making LA Modern, Craig Ellwood, Myth, Man, Designer. Here's George, poolside, with Erin Ellwood.
Erin, I understand that at one point you were the lone arranger. Tell me about that.
So the Lone Arranger was my creation to figure out how I could get myself into the interior design world. I had been in film for about 23 years as a set decorator and production designer. And then I adopted a daughter and decided to move out of Los Angeles. And I wanted to be out of film because I wanted to be an available parent to my daughter.
Yes.
So I moved to Ojai, and
Beautiful Ojai.
Beautiful Ojai, and I took a year, at least a year, it could have been more, of doing what I called inging, which was hiking, gardening, cooking, reading, swimming. I inged for a year or so to just recalibrate myself into my new world as a mother. And then, yes, I was helping my friend rearrange her room. I was at a friend's house one night, and she was unhappy with her den, and she said, "What would you do with this?" And I said, "Okay, get up, let's do it." And we changed the whole room around and moved the piano and put the bookcase on the other side and rearranged the bookcase and did this all in about an hour. And she just looked at me and she said, "You should do this. We all need this all the time." I said, I do it. I do it all the time. And she goes, "Yeah, but you should charge for it." So I was like, okay. So I was hiking later that week, and I came up with this name, The Lone Arranger, which I just thought was I wanted it to be sort of comedic in a way, instead of taking myself so seriously. And I really didn't want to use my name at the time. I just thought I'd come up with sort of something more gimmicky.
Yeah, sure.
That would get me in and not... I wanted to appeal to people that would be afraid to hire an interior designer. That seems daunting to some people. It also sounds really expensive.
Yes.
And quite frankly, it is.
Yes.
The league I'm in now, it's expensive. So I wanted to find a way into people that normally would never call someone like me and sounded affordable. So that's how I launched myself into this new career of mine.
And this was like around 2009, 2010,
yes,
roughly?
Exactly.
Way before the Marie Kondo kind of craze of cleaning out and finding your joy and all of that.
Exactly. That was just the way I grew up. That wasn't a theory to me. That was just how life should be. It should be clutter-free. It should be Marie Kondo-like.
Yeah.
I just didn't think of it as a book. I wish I had. Yeah.
Your childhood growing up, you were the daughter of an architect and an actress, which sounds kind of normal, but you had a different kind of family experience growing up. What was that like?
Well, whenever anyone asks me that, it's always challenging, because what was it like to not have that? You know what I mean? Like we all grow up. Yeah, we grow up with what we grow up with, and to us, that's normal. It's funny, when I was in the film business, somebody pointed out when they learned what my parents did, they said, "Wow, you merged your two parents together to create your career." And I hadn't thought of that. Here I am designing sets for television, so I'm in film and I'm designing. And my father was an architect and my mother was an actress, so that hadn't dawned on me that I took both their careers.
My mother was an actress in community theater, and my father was an architect, and she was the first woman radio DJ in North Carolina, full-time.
Okay, do you know that my mother was the first female DJ in New Orleans?
Really?
This is crazy, George. This is crazy.
In 1944,
Wow.
my mother started, and she worked there for 17 years and was on the air doing woman on the street kind of thing, selling saltine crackers in the weather. And they had this really corny show called Ask Your Neighbor. And you could call into the station and say, I'm baking a pecan pie, and I'm not sure how much sugar to put in it. No. And somebody else would call in and go, "Well, you need to have 1/4 cup of sugar for each pie you're going to make." And they would
Wow.
trade information across that way. Anyway.
Oh my God, that's so cool. I love that. That's crazy about our
So your mom,
parents.
Gloria Henry, in radio where? In New Orleans?
In New Orleans.
Okay.
She was born in New Orleans. Yes, she was the first female DJ, I think. She started in radio.
Okay.
And she had a different name. It was like Bobby something. They didn't use the name Gloria Henry, and that was her start into the business.
And how did she make it to Hollywood and this huge fame that came later?
She wanted to get the hell out of the South. She didn't understand racism. They had help at the house, and when she would get caught talking to the daughter of the housekeeper, she'd get in trouble, and she didn't understand that. And she was just very, intrinsically in her, it made no sense, and she didn't want to be anywhere around it. So she ended up marrying a saxophone player or a trumpet player who moved to Bakersfield. And I think that marriage only lasted a year or two.
Okay.
And somehow transitioned into LA. I can't exactly tell you how.
And how did she get the role as the mom in Dennis the Menace?
So she was under contract at Columbia at the time. So this is, I think, in the 40s under Harry Cohn.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And did around 30 B films. I don't know how much you know about him. He was like the Harvey Weinstein of the time.
Okay.
I only found this out in the last year of her life, that she was raped by him, blacklisted because she would have nothing to do with him after. She probably would have been a huge star, but he blacklisted her. She got called to try out for the part of Dennis the Menace. They loved her. He saw her on the lot and said, "You'll get that part over my dead body." And he died a week later of a heart attack.
Wow.
And she got the part.
Yeah,
So if he had lived, she wouldn't have been
She wouldn't
Dennis's
have got it.
mom. Isn't that crazy?
that is crazy. And that series went on for,
I think 4 or 5 years.
yeah,
Yeah.
immensely popular at the time. That and I think Leave It to Beaver were among the top shows.
Barbara Billingsley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did your mom meet your dad?
I believe they met in a coffee shop. And knowing my father, he probably went there knowing that's where starlets went to meet one.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think I don't know if it was Schwab's. It was like one of those near the lot. And I think he knew that's where people hung out. So that's what I think. I think my father wandered over there.
And what was he doing at the time?
At that time, I think he had that business with his brother. They were contracting. They had a firm. This is where the creation of Craig Ellwood came up because
Because he was Burke at the time.
John Burke. Yeah, when they met. I think he changed his name before they got married or soon after they did. They were contractors. They were building for other people. And they started a firm and they didn't want to use their names. So they looked across the street and saw the liquor store Lords and Ellwood
Oh, okay.
and
yeah.
thought, oh, Ellwood's a good name. Let's use that. And then they tried to think what sounds good with that, and they came up with Craig Ellwood. So they said, let's call it Craig Ellwood Associates. So that's how that came to be. And then people started calling the office and saying, can I talk to Craig? And he would say, this is Craig. So he eventually took the name.
That is really fascinating how that got created.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy.
So people were calling in, and this Craig Ellwood person was talking, and this built a persona that was just wildly popular. Mm-hmm. And he had some pretty incredible wheels, too. I always heard about a Ferrari, but I read about it was a Lamborghini, too?
Oh, there were many. So I think the first sports car I can really remember was like an orange Alfa Romeo. I don't know what the model was, but I understood later that I think that became a gift to Jim Tyler when he lured Jim Tyler from, where was Jim living? That he was working for Mies van der Rohe.
Chicago, probably.
So he moved out to California to start working for my father, and my father gave him that car.
And your father, who was not a classically trained architect at all, cultivated this office of architects
Yes,
and got a lot of work.
yes.
Started building these very highly prized houses all throughout Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. What's the first house of his you remember visiting?
The first thing that came to mind was the Rosen House. I have a
Okay.
feeling I visited others. That's the one I really remember, and probably because we got to go over and swim in the pool with our ocelot.
Yes. You had an ocelot
We had an ocelot.
named Jesus, is that recall?
Jesus.
Jesus.
Jesus. Yeah, if you see it in writing, it looks like Jesus. But it was Jesus.
Either way,
Yeah.
Jesus the ocelot is pretty interesting.
So this is when you ask me, what's it like growing up in my family?
Yeah.
So our cat is an ocelot that my father would walk like he would walk a dog down the street. You would see my dad in his little white tennis shorts walking an ocelot, which ultimately became like 4 feet long. I mean, they're big.
They are big.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
He went out to get a puppy and came home with an ocelot. I don't know what happened, but that's Craig Ellwood in a nutshell.
You had 2 brothers?
Yes.
And so there were 3 kids growing up.
Yes.
And then what happened between your mom and dad?
Well, interestingly, they were married the length of time that my father was an architect. He began his career with her, with the support. She was making the most money at the time. She was on Dennis.
Yeah.
So she was supporting. He built a studio behind our house and started his architecture career there. And when he stopped doing architecture, he left her. He basically had, a midlife crisis and left architecture, left her, moved to Italy with a woman he'd been having an affair with for many years and wanted to be a painter. Started painting paintings
And how long was he in Italy?
until he died. So,
Long time?
yeah.
Did his paintings make it back to the U.S.? Are they somewhere people can see them?
They're sort of all over. I know that Lama sold some of them. I saw 2 of them in the Palevsky house yesterday. They're in the guest rooms. They're spread around. Different collectors have them. I've seen them for sale here and there. I think there's a book on his paintings.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
Just a brand new book.
Yes.
Now, I know with me, I chose a career that was not related to design at all, which was strategic planning, different side of the brain. But it just exploded in me one day. It's like it was a little time bomb waiting to go off. And I've talked to so many children of architects who, no matter what profession that they go into, it comes out in them too. In some way, it emerges itself in their choice of housing or clothing or how they decorate their kitchen or what kind of paper they like to work on or anything else like that. And I've also seen it happen with grandchildren. So sometimes it'll skip a generation
Yeah.
and kind of show up.
That's
So
interesting.
I was wondering, with your daughter who was adopted, has she taken on any same kind of design interest?
Not yet, but she has a great sensibility. She won't admit it. And I think that's just pushing off of me right
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Like, I wouldn't want to do what you do kind
Yeah,
of thing.
'cause you're a parent,
But
right.
I've seen this happen before where it comes out later. So she's only 21. She's graduating in June in psychology. She doesn't really want to do anything with psychology. She just is intrigued with it. And more towards fashion. I think if anything, she'll end up in the clothing world, like as a wardrobe stylist or something.
fashion space.
That's what she would like to do, yeah.
What do you think is the allure of your dad's houses? Why are people so galvanized around them? Because it really is a strong attraction.
I would say simplicity. I think things have become incredibly complicated in every way, politically, in the arts, weather. There's so much complexity and there's so much simplicity. It's a very straightforward approach to living. I mean, why should the way we live be complicated? I think it should be very simple. When we come home, we should have a sense of calm and simplicity because most of our worlds are pretty complicated. And I think it just goes back to a very, it's the beginning of the time of this indoor-outdoor thing. And everybody wants that now. We want to be more in tune with nature. So I think the architecture is always very in tune to nature. So many forms of architecture don't invite that in. And I would say that's what it is. It's just simplicity and wanting to connect with nature.
And most of these houses were really very modest in size. I mean, some as little as 1,200, 1,500 square feet.
Yeah.
I think the house that we were together in recently was one of his largest houses altogether.
Yes.
And people look at these little jewel box houses, and it's just so intricately put together. There's an expression you were quoted on: peanut butter fanaticism.
Yes.
Yeah. What does that mean?
I had some this morning. Oh, my father was a peanut butter fanatic. I'll never forget him packing whenever he would go to Europe, because the peanut butter in Europe was like healthy. It was just grounded peanuts.
Didn't have the sugar
so
in it.
it separated and was funky. He didn't
Yeah.
like that. He always brought Skippy. He'd pack his suitcase with like 2 jars of Skippy. And one of his favorite snacks was peanut butter and saltines. So it's just weird. To this day, I love peanut butter, and so did he. So I think that had to do with him.
Just be true to your aesthetic,
Just be
right?
true to your peanut butter aesthetic.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, it's one of the great foods of life. It goes
It
well
is.
on bananas, crackers.
Yes, I'm a crunchy Jif man myself.
Okay.
I know that because you've been influenced by your dad and by architecture, that there's this influence of the Bauhaus. But you've figured out how to move on from that in what you do. Tell me about that.
Well, one thing I think I wrote that essay called Growing Up with Uncomfortable Furniture.
Yeah.
That was in the book that Michael Boyd and I worked on. In doing interior design now for so many years, I'm constantly coming up against this thing of wanting things to look great, but also be very functional and comfortable, because that's not the world I grew up in. Nothing was comfortable. My bed was not comfortable. Our sofas were not comfortable. We had the Laverne sofa, the Eames compact sofa. They're like sitting on cardboard. I mean, they're, but I didn't know until I started hanging out at my friends' houses that had like soft couches and
Oh my God,
mattresses.
this feels so good.
Yeah. My career in interior design has been an ongoing search of finding that intersection between what looks great and the functionality of it. I truly believe things should function well. I do not let any of my clients get anything that only looks good. There's no point in that anymore. And I think everyone's, well, at least as you get older, you actually want to sit in your things.
Yes.
And not get
Not just look at them?
and not just look at them and not have them hurt your back. And I don't like anything that looks one way. I see these people do this in Palm Springs. They buy these homes, and everything in them has to be legitimate. Mid-century modern, from this date, from this designer. That's not interesting to me. It's easy to do, and it looks like a museum.
Yes.
I'd prefer to mix things up. I like things to look like my house is a collection of me over the last 50 years. It's furniture from my family, art from my family, but new things that I've gotten. It's just, I like an eclectic. But that's my sensibility. I'm not judging people that do it another way. My look is eclectic. I like to mix it up.
So are there any particular projects you've done the last few years you're proud of?
Yeah. I'm working on a lot of great things right now. I worked on, do you know Luta Maria Riggs?
Mm-mm.
So she was the first woman that got into the AIA in California.
Okay.
Santa Barbara architect. She worked for George Washington Smith
Okay.
in Santa Barbara. It's interesting because he wouldn't even give her a seat for a couple of weeks because women weren't able to do that. And once he could see her drawing chops, she was an amazing illustrator and she really became who he was. I mean, she made him who he was, but got no recognition. And he suddenly died, and then suddenly she did a pivot because it was during the mid-century thing, and she went from doing these, Spanish revival, very elaborate, beautiful, beautiful homes to doing mid-century modern. And I worked on one in Santa Barbara a few years ago that was it's magnificent, it's beautiful. So did that. I'm working on a ground-up in Ojai designed by C.J. Paon that's really great. I'm working on another Spanish one in Montecito right now that's a historical property purchased by these two designers. One's British and one's French. They have a great sensibility, so that's really interesting and very eclectic. So yeah, I'm working on some really good stuff right now. It's great.
So I remember way back 40 years ago, Ojai was this idyllic place people referenced with open spaces and inexpensive land and, just a couple restaurants and a store. You could go out there, you could get away from all the drama of Hollywood, much like people used to say about Ventura, for instance. And now both of those areas have really stocked up with a lot more development.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of rules in Ojai, so I don't know if it'll ever get overbuilt. It certainly is not cheap, like you said, or affordable. That's changed. It's very expensive. A lot of Hollywood has moved there, especially during COVID. A lot of people moved away from Hollywood during that time. So it's a very interesting demographic of people. It's farmers, it's movie stars, it's people like me who went there I wanted to put my daughter through a really good school system that was public. I just thought I want to take advantage of this. And so from kindergarten to high school, she went to school in Ojai. Mm-hmm. It was great. Got her into UC Irvine, not an easy school to get into.
Right, sure.
So it certainly didn't fail. But it's still very peaceful. I love it. I've only been there 15 or so years. For people that have been there much longer, they think it's gotten way too crowded, way too mini Hollywood.
Oh, yeah.
I like it. Feels cool to me, but some people never like those kinds of changes.
You've been working on a movie about your dad for a while. We talked about that last time you were here. What's happening with that?
We keep reworking it. It began as a documentary, and as we worked on it more, we interviewed a lot of great people, including Ray Cappy, and we got some great interviews from people. But then we just thought we saw this more as a feature film. So my partner and I, Maria Demopoulos, started working on that. And then we thought, well, maybe it's like an 8-episode Netflix thing. I think that's really the pocket I'd kind of like to be in. So we just kind of keep reworking it, working on it, writing it, sharing things. It's just these things take a while. And
sure.
I wish we had a couple $1 million and we could just do it ourselves.
I wonder if any great producers have bought a Craig Ellwood house somewhere. That could be your inside person.
That would be nice.
We'll have to look all that up.
Yeah. Will you look into that, please, George?
I will look into that for you.
All right, cool.
Our team will call your team.
Okay, excellent.
Erin, thank you so much for coming and talking with me again, and we're so glad to have you here with us in Palm Springs.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
That was George talking with Erin Ellwood.
Returning podcast guest, vocalist, and songwriter Lucy Woodward was born in London and grew up in New York City and the Netherlands. The daughter of a conductor/composer and an opera singer/musicologist, she was accepted to the Manhattan School of Music at age 16 to study jazz. After a foray into pop stardom with her own top 40 hit, Blindsided, which you should look up on YouTube because it's fantastic, she went back to her jazz roots with the 2008 album Lucy Woodward is Hot and Bothered. Since then, she has recorded many additional records, filled in for Pink Martini's lead singer on tour, and collaborated with the group Snarky Puppy. Her new album is titled Stories from the Dust. Welcome back, Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's so nice to chat with you again. I remember last time Tom and I sang Ragdoll to you in the studio, and I understand that song kind of continues to have life in dance studios. Tell me about that.
It's amazing. That song came out when I did a record on Verve, on a record called Hooked, and Ragdoll came out. We did a fun little video, and I had big curly hair and, really just fun kind of 1940s inspired. And I don't sing that song on tour much anymore now, but every few months or so I get someone posting or sending me a video or tagging me in something where there's either like a burlesque artist, a drag queen, or a choreographer who is using the song in their dance studio to create some great dance. And all these students of that class, they tag me, they post me, and these are incredible, choreographed pieces.
Yes.
They're really great dancers and all these performers. So there's this kind of life that keeps going, keeps living way past the due date of that song when that song came out. So cool. It's really cool to see that.
It is a lot of fun. You get a bunch of slightly inebriated Southern guys all singing that together, and it is a hilarious experience.
Welcome it. I welcome it.
Now, at some point in your life, you were at a karaoke booth in the mall and something happened. What was that?
When I was 12, I went to the mall with some friends, and there was these kiosks where you pay $20 to sing 2 songs. And I sang maybe a Whitney Houston song, and I just like, let me just see what happens. And, I have no idea. And I sang, I think, how will I know if he really loves me? And I was like, something shimmered through my body, and I was like, this feels right. And I was 12, and I went home and I was like, Mom, I'm going to be a singer. That's it. It was like something, it's not just singing in choir. It's not just singing in the house when my mom was a singer, and it's not just tooling around, hobbying. I was like, I've found my calling. This is it.
Yeah. Isn't that a great feeling when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, and also you don't experience those things when you're that young. I mean, you do have a fun time at a birthday party, or you connect with a movie or something, but to really feel like your life calling was like, oh yeah, this is different. I have to pay attention to that.
And now fast forward to 2024. You have a new album out, Stories from the Dust. Mm-hmm. Tell me about this first song, Frey.
Oh, this song, Frey, actually, I started writing it maybe 2016 or something like that. And I was on tour. I think I told you last time, I'm not sure, but I used to sing background vocals for Rod Stewart for a few years, for like 4.5 years. And it was as part of the tour where I was starting to think, I don't know if I want to do this job anymore, because it is a job, and it was a wonderful job. And Rod Stewart's amazing. And I was seeing the world at business class and great hotels and beautiful cities. But it was the point in my time there that I was like, I need to go back and be an artist, because I'd put out records before, and I really wanted to, I had songs in me that I still needed to write. So I came home from a tour, and I was hanging up my laundry and washing it and holding on to memories from a tour, and knowing that I had to like fix things in my life, in my personal life, to make, that point, like the whole balance of the yin and yang of like balance personal, So there were deep changes that I had to make in my life as a touring professional. And I was, a backup singer mixed with the personal at home. How do I want to build this life as this crazy world as a freelance performer who lives out of a suitcase for years at a time? The Frey is literally about like the unraveling of a piece of clothing that you keep pulling that thread, and eventually it's going to fall apart, but you're doing everything to sort of like keep it together. So this whole video that we made of it involves brightly colored yarn and 2 other dancers, and the whole kind of movie is sort of unraveling, and I'm the one pulling the thread. But that was, it took me years to finish it, I think, because when I started the idea in 2016 or 17, I have voice memos that are labeled that year in my phone. But I think the feeling was so deep that I actually couldn't handle it. So I didn't finish it until another 4 years later, because I was like, okay, I'm ready to face this lyric,
Here's Lucy Woodward with Frey.
I washed the clothing that I wore. Some things you just don't ever throw away. Stitched up the holes that weren't there before. I snipped the threads, I scrubbed the stains. Yeah, I broke my men in two. I did things I didn't know I could do. Him up and myself too, 'cause there's a life we get back to if I start to unravel and then I start to fray. I gotta keep it together or I won't be okay, 'cause there are strings that bind us, and once it tires down, it's as tiny as a needle in a stack of hay, but bigger than a house if I let it fray. There are days the house is hushed. I move around all the furniture. It's what I do when times are tough. It's a blessing, it's a curse. Some things I just can't ever throw away. Stitched up the holes that weren't there before. I snipped the threads, I scrubbed the stains, and then we start to unravel, and then we start to pray. We gotta keep it together in our own little way, 'cause there are things that bind us and ones that tear us down. It's as tiny as a needle in a stack of hay, but bigger than a house if I let it fray. If I let it fray. If I let it
Lucy, we've had China Forbes on the show, and we've had Storm Large on the show. So I'm intrigued to know that you played with Pink Martini at some point. When was that?
Oh my God, it was a great time. That was 2012. China was going through a lot of vocal problems, and she had to get this kind of emergency vocal surgery,
Yeah.
nodes or something. So they called me. Thomas, the band leader, had found me through another mutual friend and said, will you come and, audition on Skype? No one used Zoom then. So can you just sing a few of these songs? Just sing the English ones,
Right.
because they sing in so many languages. And I sort of sang to him, and he goes, great, you're hired. Come, can you be here like by Friday? I mean, it was sort of like a 5-day notice thing. So I think Storm couldn't fill in, and then I had to fill in for both of them or something like that. It was like a rotating chair for those like 6 months. So China did that and was healing, and she's now stronger than ever.
Yes.
And we actually just played together a couple of months ago in Germany, and we got to sing the encore together and forget your troubles, I'm happy. So we sang a whole duet at the end. It was great. And it was actually the first time we'd ever sung on stage together. And that was 11 years later. But it was an incredible time because Thomas said, okay, just don't worry about the foreign languages. Don't worry about the Chinese. Don't worry about the Greek. Don't worry about the French. Just sing the songs in English. And then like 2 days before the first show in Montreal Jazz Fest, he says, okay, we're going to need you to sing Russian, Japanese, Turkish, French, Spanish. And I was like, what? So he let me keep the lyrics on stage, but it was such a it was like such an incredible gig. My brain was on fire, just absorbing and learning. And it was a really incredible time.
One of the group's songs, Amado Mio, which is one of my favorites, I didn't realize till recently was a hit by Rita Hayworth in the movie Gilda.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Because it's never mentioned that the other song she sings in that movie is Put the Blame on Mame, where she does this little striptease with one glove coming off, and that's it. And that got all the publicity. But Amado Mio is a much better song. And of course, Pink Martini, no matter who sings it, does such an extraordinary job with that song.
Yeah. And I remember they would always start with Bolero, an instrumental, and then the first number of whoever was singing, like basically the second song would come on, and that would be their opening number. So it'd be, like a big long note. I'm singing quietly now. It's like, it's so memorable. Like I can feel it. So dramatic.
Well, we have to get Thomas on the show sometime and chat about that whole arc of the group, because it's really one of my favorites. And they are perpetually on tour. They're always going to some place and filling the houses.
So good. Such a fun show.
This next song is called Old to You. What's that about?
It's about being with someone for eternity. And you start when you're young. Like you fall in love with someone and you're going to be with them forever, and you're going to watch their face grow old, and they're going to watch your face grow old, and all these things we do to keep ourselves young and fit and healthy, especially as a performer, and we're running around, and from moisturizer to curling our hair, whatever, they're going to see the other side, and they're going to see you age, and they're going to see you plump out a little. And so the song is called I'm Going to Look Old to You One Day. I may not be your dancing queen, but I may not wear these tight blue jeans, but I'll still be your dancing queen. I feel like I was I'm very inspired by Peggy Lee and Julie London. And so really that kind of storytelling, like it's a little bit rock and roll in the sense of it's modernized. I wasn't trying to sound old-fashioned and an old-fashioned Cole Porter lyric or anything, but the bridge is sort of, I don't know what got into me that night, martinis seem to do that on the road, like it's clearly my life,
Yes.
So meeting someone on the road, falling in love with them, but you're going to be with them till the end of time, until you're 6 feet under. So and they're going to watch you change and you're going to watch them change. So that's what the song is.
Here's Lucy with Old to You.
I'm gonna look old to you one day. I'm gonna look old to you one day. I may not wear these tight blue jeans, but I'll still be your glitter queen in blue lame. And I'll no longer be a mystery. You might wake up and hardly recognize me. Laughing lines engrave our cheeks from going at it, so to speak. I'm gonna look old to you one day. I don't know what got into me that summer night. Martinis seem to do that on the road. We both know that rock and roll won't ever die, and all of my inhibitions were lined with silver and gold, and we cannot forever be earthbound. I'll still find a way to cuddle up underground. You'll need an afterlife chanteuse to sing your melodies to you. And I'm gonna look old to you one day.
Lucy, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you for coming back on the show and sharing your new album. And I can't wait to see you touring all around.
Yeah, I will be sure to let you know when I'm coming through. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. Want to go with us to Modernism Week in February 2025 and stay with our crew at the U.S. Modernist Compound? Email me at george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Mr. Kyle, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,500 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with Kelly Policelli on guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guyout. George and I will be back soon with another Sittin' by the Pool, Under the Umbrella, Sipping a Vanilla Latte Palm Springs edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.